I can see it. All right, good. All right. Well, it is Monday, May 2nd, 2022. I'm Steven Sersky, and here is episode number 2 for my language acquisition vlogcast, I guess you could say. And we are during this weekend, actually, from May 1st until May 4th. It's the long weekend here in Beijing, China, or at least in China. So there's not much going on. We also have the spread of the newest variant of the virus. So things are a little bit quiet, which is good. And you'd think that it's a great time to be spending some time recording or studying and getting things done. And I'll tell you, I have not felt motivated at all. And this, I actually want to think about. Let's see what this is. There's a few things I was thinking about for the second episode because as I do work in the ESL industry, and I'm one of these, and I help out in the assessment of some of people's language abilities. Some of the questions that I get are in regard to, like, how do you make your English better? How do you make your language any better? And I sympathize with them because of the fact that with my Chinese and even with my Russian, I understand it's very difficult, especially if you don't live in a country that speaks the language or uses the language on a daily basis, that it's just very difficult to be able to practice and get the necessary exposure to become more proficient. And some of the students that I meet here in China, they actually have a couple of problems that they commonly talk about. Now, number one is grammar. They think that it's not that they think they want to improve their grammar, but then they also want to improve their pronunciation. But sometimes I wonder if they're actually talking about their fluency. And this is something that, as a language learner myself and as an educator, I do have. I mean, I'm exposed to this myself. Whereas in my own Chinese abilities, my own Chinese studies, it's difficult to hear it sometimes at how good or how bad my language has gotten. And move that chair up. There we go. And be able to gauge just how much I've improved or unimproved, gotten worse over time. Grammar is a tricky one because it's very specific, very I wouldn't say it's subjective, but it depends on your own abilities and your own deficiencies. What aren't you getting about the grammar? And one of the things that I'm actually working on right now as an educator, because I'm thinking about doing the Delta, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with what the Delta is a Diploma of English Language Teaching for Adults. It's sort of a step up from the CELTA, which is the Cambridge English Language Teaching for Adults certificate. Or no, sorry, not Cambridge. Certificate for English Language Teaching for Adults or of Adults, and both of these, the CELTA and the Delta, are put on by Cambridge University. So I was looking at doing this, and so I've been reading a little bit more about how to develop better grammar teaching, grammar education. And I'll tell you, it's difficult to give any one person a definitive answer on how to improve the grammar. I know for my own language studies with Chinese and with Russian, for a language like Russian, for a native English speaker, naturalized English speaker, one of the things that I found, grammatically speaking, it's the conjugations, the declensions. So knowing which verbs decline in which way, how the nouns, the gender of the nouns, so masculine, feminine, neuter, and then also being able to tell what sort of case they are in, whether it's dative, ablative, nominative, genitive, or future, or past, or and what type of future or past it is. In Chinese, the difficulty with the grammar is that it's actually weighed down not so much by the grammar itself, but by the access to the language by way of the Chinese characters. And the reason I put it that way is because when you look at a piece of Chinese text and you are reading it, even if you are able to read it, a lot of times, or at least at my level, HSK 5, I'm hitting that level right now, it's difficult to appreciate the grammar or the functionality of each of the characters or the words or the sentence structures because I'm concentrating so much on looking at the characters and their meaning, and they're making sure that I actually understand what they mean, basically. And so what that sort of leads me to do is I spend more time studying vocab in Chinese rather than focusing on grammar. I've also noticed that a lot of Chinese teachers, especially the younger ones, and this is very much the case for people who are either fresh graduates, they don't get a lot of the grammar as well. Or at least if they do, they can only point you to where the textbook, what the textbook says. It's very difficult for them to explain it in any sort of student-specific or contextual manner. The same thing happens with ESL teachers, and I empathize with this because as an English teacher, I find it difficult to explain things. And one of the things that I'm learning with these Delta studies that I'm doing is that it's to teach grammar what we take for granted and think, well, that's just the way it is. That's how we have said it all along. That is your innate learning of the grammar of a language. Grammar and culture are very closely allied because the way that one culture or one people think of how to structure their sentences depends on how they think. It's how they reason, how they the logic, and then also I would almost think it's geographically specific as well. In that situation, in that geography, that area, that region of the world, what makes them think in a certain way. But I mean that's getting into more linguistics and the study of like how languages develop. So it's not so much linguistics; it's more about the history of how languages develop. But so if people want to focus on their grammar, there's really only one thing that I've noticed is to be able to find a book, a source wherein you're able to pick apart the grammar functions that you want to work on and then just focus on those. Chinese is notorious for this, and I've mentioned this a few times before, wherein they don't have these grammar drills that we do in English. And a lot of English textbooks, the Collins IELTS preparation books, those have a lot of drills available to them. IELTS Advantage, I think he has a bunch of drills, like standard blocks of text that you can sort of fit in your own answer. You can personalize it using his structure. And then the Cambridge books are okay as well for the IELTS test, but those are more geared towards testing rather than general English acquisition, general language acquisition. The one big book for grammar that I know of and that I've used a lot in my classes, it's Raymond Murphy's Advanced Grammar in Use, or Grammar in Use, one of those titles. And that book, it's about that thick, and it has lots of exercises, lots of drills, lots of examples. It gives you an example of, or it takes a part of English grammar and then says, okay, we're going to just work on this for the next page and a half or 2 pages, and that's what he does. So it's very useful. And for that textbook, or sorry, it is a textbook. That textbook, I usually photocopy them and give them out to my students as well. So it's Raymond Murphy's Advanced Grammar in Use. That's the book that I typically go to first to when students want to improve their grammar. The other way that I have found that helps with the grammar is that once you study that in isolation, that one part, the next thing to do is to be able to find it, hear it, isolate it in actual speech. Whether it's speech or writing, I guess would sort of depend on what you are focusing on developing. For me, in Chinese, actually, when I'm listening, I'm trying to find these structures. And then also in reading, so it's a lot of passive listening. Being able to speak it grammatically correctly, that's still a ways away. And then also being able to write it grammatically correctly, also a little bit of a ways away from me, at least in terms of getting the grammar 100% correct in the Chinese language. Not daunted, but it's you need to. I found that you need to, with grammar, you need to develop a feel for the language. If you don't have that feel for the language, which comes from understanding more of the culture, from not just watching their movies and their TV shows, but even spending time with the people to understand how they think. And that will help your grammar because you start understanding how people organize their thoughts. And that's something that is difficult to learn from a textbook, although I can say that here in China, I've met quite a few Chinese teachers and quite a few Chinese people who learned their English and their grammar from basically watching movies and TV shows. More often than not, it was Friends. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you are trying to work on your grammar. The part about fluency and pronunciation, this gets me because with fluency, these two, they're very similar in the sense that they're usually spoken, but and they also sort of lead to whether or not people can understand what you're saying and follow along. But the key difference between fluency and pronunciation is that fluency, you can be fluent, but your pronunciation can be terrible, or you can pronounce words very well, but your fluency can be terrible. The reason for that is because pronunciation comes down to how you actually say the phonemes of the word, how you actually say each individual word, and whether or not you chunk them properly. And this is not something that's taught in a lot of English lessons, at least not directly. What happens instead with the ESL world, we tend to teach idioms or phrasal verbs, collocations, something called, it'd be more along the lines of like it's standard ways of saying things. Formulaic language almost fits into that, but I would almost say that fits more into fluency as well, in that pronunciation comes down to if you're saying each vowel pair, the consonant and the vowel together, are they sounding how they normally sound, or how generally the speakers of that language think they should sound. So the vowel pairs, the word pairs, like the letter pairs, are you putting together the right words together? So it's collocations, that's chunking, and then can people basically understand what you are saying, which is goes back to being able to put all those things together, the individual letters, and then the words, which words go together and which words have sort of a pause in between them. Fluency deals more with the ability to keep on going even if you don't know either what needs to be said, so using pausing techniques, you'll notice that I say a lot of times like, so those are pausing techniques that, right there, that indicate to your listener, to the person that you're talking to, that you are continuing on with your thought, you're not finished your sentence, and that there's more to come, but you need to either think very quickly of, you need to give some thought about what you're going to say next, or how best to say it. The other thing about fluency, how to gauge your fluency, is to think about where you are pausing or where you are stopping. For me, in Chinese, it's just about everywhere. Pretty much 85% of my sentences are disconnected, disjointed, and I'm stopping all over the place, trying to think of the proper word or something to say in that situation. But to fix that comes down to not just knowing collocations, but something called formulaic language, wherein formulaic language gives you a certain standard something to say that's maybe 2 or 3 words long, or it's a chunk. For example, let me think about that. Let me think of an example for you. Formulaic language. You can say that to pause, to signal to the person that you're talking to that you have something to say. You can think of it, but you haven't got it just yet. So using a pausing, like a sentence filler in that sort of sentence, that situation, that will help in terms of being able to keep on going. And then once you do, when you have that thought ready and you actually speak it, where do you pause in your sentences? Are you pausing for simple words that most people would be able to understand or be able to generate? Or are you pausing for concepts? Are you pausing for a specific word that might describe better the situation? And that will, determining where you pause in the sentence and for what types of words you're pausing, that's where you would sort of fit on, the type of levels of your fluency. How to fix this? Okay, so to fix fluency, formulaic language would be one of the easiest ways. So working on your starting a sentence. Well, that's a very good question. Let me think about that for a second. Okay, so you have that one type. Then you have in the middle of the sentence, like, but to think of another example, I would have to say, so again, another standard chunk of words, and then at the end, and that's about all I could really think about that. So you have 3 different parts where it's formulaic, it signals a structure to what you're saying, and to your whole thought process, rather than pausing and never having really an end or a pacing to your speech. This, in order to teach this, for teachers, it's best to have a sort of a worksheet that you can give the students to practice these formulaic parts of the sentences. I know it was a DC IELTS Simon, one of them. They had a very good worksheet from years ago that they had, and that, again, it was more for the IELTS test than anything else, but that type of structuring your sentence actually fits in quite well with being able to speak English, and then also understanding how people are structuring their thought patterns in spoken language or in the written language as well. One of the other ways to practice fluency is to watch public speakers, and if you can, find the transcript of that speech. A lot of the politicians in the United States, I think in Canada, I'm not sure about Britain and Europe if they do the same thing, where they publish the speeches of the government leaders. There's transcripts, I think, of all the congressional and all the governmental conversations in-house and stuff like that. So you can find those. Movies are a little bit different because it's not real speech in a movie. Those are highly tailored words a lot of times. And by highly tailored, I mean they're scripted, they're kind of based on reality, but they're more meant for emotional appeal. Whereas if you go to things like what the government is saying, public speakers, they are speaking for people like mass audiences, usually into a microphone. Speaking into a microphone and making a podcast or a vlog will typically be a lot slower than speaking to someone face to face. It's just how the language, how we are able to follow along best with people. So finding examples of speeches, even just a paragraph. You could read books out loud, but books are meant to be written. A lot of them are. They're not meant to be spoken out loud. Although nowadays what you are seeing, there is more of a move towards audiobooks and writing as if someone is speaking to you. The vast majority of books, however, are meant to be read, especially the classic books. Like I know a lot of my students would want to read, was it Pride and Prejudice or Dickens? Like these classic books from 100 years ago or so, which is not only using older English, but it's also, those were all meant to be read. They were not meant to be dictated at all. So I would encourage you to find public speeches more than to simply read books out loud, if that's what you're going to do with that. In terms of other thing, I'm looking at my list here for my show notes. With the undue pauses, I think that's sort of your biggest thing, and then making sure you know when to end the sentence using that structure I meant before. But then also, if you watch people who do public speaking, they will have a certain ebb and flow, a certain flow to their speech, which then enables them to keep the attention of the audience and that they're understood. They're not crushing all of their words together under any sort of nervousness or anxiety. I guess, one of the other things I would almost suggest that you do these days is start a podcast. Now, why don't I do that in Chinese? Well, because my pronunciation is garbage. Pretty much. Horrible pronunciation. At least I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that just yet. Russian or Ukrainian, possibly Latin. I've seen a few more Latin podcasts pop up. There seems to be a resurgence in interest in the classics in those languages, possibly because people can do this on the side, right? They don't have to do it necessarily for a job or for any sort of compensation, financial compensation, money, basically. If you could start a podcast, this is probably even better I'm not sure if it's better for people who are studying English, because English, there are so many accents, there are so many people speaking English that it's acceptable if your language is rough. It's not a language that's closed off at all. A lot of people, a lot of English speakers, if they're not from a native language background, like if they're not born in one of there's 7 countries that are sort of considered your native English speakers, Canada, US, Britain, South Africa, Ireland, Scotland, Australia. There might be one more. I'm missing one probably. But if you're not from one of those, then, you could be in North Africa, you could be in Turkey, you could be in Ukraine, you could be in Argentina and speak perfect English. You might not be able to get a job very easily because you're not from one of those other 7 countries. But with that, the breadth of speakers of the English language gives the language a lot more leeway in terms of any mistakes that are made. So if you're going to start a podcast, might be a good way. a good way to practice, to get out of that bubble, get out of your own head, and to give yourself a record of your progress. I do have recordings from my Chinese speaking from years ago. Terrible, horrible. I don't want to let those out just yet. And compared to today, I think it has improved. Not just my pronunciation, but my vocabulary, my tones, and my fluency has also improved quite a bit as well. So having that spoken record, having a written record as well, I've found that those are very helpful in terms of being able to gauge my own progress in my speaking abilities. And one of the best ways to keep track of all this, if you're not willing to do that, I think you should. I think it'd be a good idea, especially since cell phones, computers, they're so, like electronics, they're so ubiquitous, they're all over the place, that it's almost silly not to not to try it out anyway. One of the other ways that I have found in general to track my language progress is to keep a spreadsheet and break it down in the different skills. So speaking, listening, reading, writing, and then also add another column for grammar, and because grammar will be different from the other four, like those four main skills. The four main skills are like you could listen to the radio for an hour and can mark that down. You could write out words 100 times each. Write that down as your mission accomplished. Speaking, reading a book out loud would be a form of speaking. Doing a podcast would be a form of speaking, and then also reading. I mean, you could read signs for half an hour or whatever, or read a brochure and consider it to be done, right? Grammar would be the focused study of those elements of the language, of the grammatical parts of the language. So, and I used to do that a lot with Chinese to keep myself motivated, especially for HSK 3 and 4. The issue, actually, one of the good things about the Chinese studies that they have is that they give you a sort of a target level of how many hours, in theory, most students would take to accomplish and that level of Chinese proficiency and move up to the next. And what was it? HSK 3 was like 90 hours. HSK 4 was 180, I think. And then HSK 5 was like 270. And then you'd be surprised at how it seems easy. If you spend an hour a day on the language in 270 days, you'll have the language done, right? Finding the time to do it, focusing, motivation, and being able to actually understand what's being said in that hour, those are a little bit more difficult. But that's why it's important to have that spreadsheet, to be able to have a written record of how much you've done. And so at the end of the month, you're looking at it and going, yes, at least I did that. And you can look, kind of like last week where I was talking about reviewing my Chinese textbooks. Now, I don't keep a spreadsheet anymore because the amount of time I was spending on the language was just, it was all the time. It was no longer any specific time that I was sitting down to focus anymore. Instead, it was I have 5 minutes here. I'm going to practice a character. I see a sign. I'll read that. What's that character? Write that down. Make a note of it. Here's a brochure. I'll read that for a couple minutes. So keeping track of the 2 or 3 minutes or the half an hour that I was spending on it just became more of a nuisance than anything else. It wasn't helping me anymore. But at the beginning of your studies, or if you're feeling a plateau, if you're struggling to get through them, I would actually encourage my students to keep a spreadsheet of the hours that they spend in contact with the language, because it helps quite a bit to make sure that you're progressing, even though it might not feel like you're progressing at all, right? And so yeah, that's how I would sort of think of how to deal with your grammar, how to speak more fluently, and how to improve pronunciation. There are some books. Michael Swan is and I think it's English in Use. Can't remember the book title. Oh, I should have written that one down. But he takes, this is more for English teachers, and you'll know this book if you've taken the CELTA or if you're even taking the Delta. There are several textbooks that are very useful in helping students understand their own. Typically, it's a cultural or geographical area that has a difficulty with some phonemes of the English language. So the Japanese students typically have issues with the L and the R. They interchange them quite a bit. Korean learners, they typically add at the end of a lot of their words, and it's because of how the Korean language spaces or breathes during its pronunciation. Europeans have heard this a little bit. You hear it in sort of both East and West Europe, where they will have trouble with the S and the Z. They interchange those sometimes. It's not always clear which one they're using, or they'll use it just a little bit more harshly compared to what someone else would use it if they were born in those languages. And then the other one for Spanish, well, not so much Spanish, but Spanish speakers, South America, with the H and the J sound, and they will, or the G sound, they will take that first language pronunciation of it and put it into their English pronunciation of it. But knowing that sort of that issue with those learners, if you have a class here in China, I mean, it's all just Chinese students primarily, so we don't have to deal with a multicultural or so much of an international collection of students so much. Instead, if you know that and you're saying, okay, well, if I have someone who's spoken Spanish their entire life, you might have this issue. We have a Japanese learner or another learner from East Asia. They might have this issue. If they're from Europe, they might have that issue. So it's something to be aware of if you are an English teacher and addressing an international classroom. If you are a student from one of those areas, understanding that you do have difficulties with that pronunciation, you'll be able to better focus on either on eliminating it or being able to work around it in some way. And so, yeah, that's, the other question I get is, well, which one is better, American or British English? And I go, I don't think people care. People, face-to-face, over the phone, podcasts, people aren't going to care. In terms of getting a job for in a specific company, yeah, they might care. Let's put it this way: in terms of learning Chinese, it's you might know Chinese, but then you show up at the company and everyone is speaking Cantonese, and you're going, I don't know Cantonese. Cantonese and Mandarin are a little different. Cantonese also typically uses the traditional characters, whereas Mandarin uses the simplified characters, which again is like, can you read Chinese? Well, sure, I can make my way through it. And then they give you a book in traditional Chinese, and you're like, that's not what I was expecting. I should have known better. And then same with I've heard this comparison recently that Russia and Ukraine are similar, that they're brothers, and the difference is but the languages are different. I mean, there are similarities between them, but the way that you read Russian and the way that you read Ukrainian, it's different. They also use different words to describe usually the same thing as well. So that's something to be aware of when you are thinking about what accent you want to learn. So American and British, I know a lot of people are partial towards the American accent, and I know Canadian. I'm Canadian. We have good accents. We have good, clean accents. We're often confused for the Americans, never for the British and never for Australians. But good, clean accent that's clear. That's a lot of people are probably the most accessible accent, I would say. Not to say that other accents aren't as equally that can't be accessible, but that's what I've experienced. That's what I've seen over my career in the ESL world. if people want to focus on one accent or another, typically it's because they are going to go move to that country, or because the job that they want to do, for example, voice acting, or if they're working with companies that are based in that location, that's when they would need to be a little bit more specific in their accent development. Overall, in your day-to-day life, it's not going to make a big difference. People aren't going to care. So it does come down to what your target audience is. Do you plan on moving to one of these places? Do you plan on moving to, or do you plan on moving, working for a company that has clients in one of those places? Same with Australian. It's they have a unique accent as well. So that's where you might need to work on your dialect instead of just your generic English instead, right? Chinese has dialects as well, and I struggle whenever I travel around the country. But that being the case, it's not something that can easily be accessed. And I say that because in order to become proficient in a dialect, you need to be in that community. It's not like they publish books in a dialect, right? They publish all the books in a standard Mandarin, and then if you go speak to someone from that part of the country about that book, they will talk about it differently than you will, because you studied standard Mandarin and they've studied their dialect, right? They also study standard Mandarin, like the standard books as well. That's why it's called standard Mandarin. But since they live in a different region, maybe they don't need to speak standard Mandarin at all. So instead, they speak their dialect and know, bits and pieces of the Mandarin language as it is. All right. Well, so that was a little bit of a yik yak for ESL teachers, ESL learners. Hope that was a little bit helpful to you guys. Since it is the long weekend, I haven't been able to do very much, and we're sitting at the beginning of May, which means that I have 14 more days until I have to decide whether or not I'm going to sign up for my HSK 5 test, which if I sign up on May 16th, I think is the last day, then that means I will be writing my test in June. And given the fact that I'm not done my textbooks yet, I'm not sure, and I'm thinking of it because I have a few more. I was doing some of it today in terms of so I did chapter 14. I did that one finally. I finished that. I did the grammar. So, don't laugh at my sentences. They're horrible. I also did this portion. This part's actually really helpful. I don't know why we weren't doing this in my class before, but this portion of putting all the words, this would be like your collocations almost, your formulaic language right there, teaching students what words typically go together. And so you get the pronunciation, you have the characters, but then you have the pronunciation of that set of characters, and they usually go with these sets of characters over here. So it's very useful, which is something you don't really think about when you're speaking or when you're reading a language. And then, of course, I did the fill in the blanks, this is nice and easy stuff. I like this part of the book because it's a little bit easier and it's not as mentally taxing. Not as mentally taxing as the grammar portion. The grammar portion is probably the most mentally taxing part of it all. Same with the text. The text can be mentally anguishing, mentally taxing. But so I did chapter 14 today. I will do the test probably some other time because there's an associated test with every chapter. But that at least gets that done. So on to chapter 15. I reviewed the vocab today, but that was about it. And I'll leave this again for tomorrow. It was a struggle getting motivated to do this today. I'm not going to lie. I did not want to do my language studies, but I figured if I do it, then by the end of the day, I'll feel better that I had done it rather than that I didn't do it. 明白了不？明白了吗？对吗？ I got in trouble on Friday. I was saying "明白不?" and apparently that's not something you say to other people that you don't really know, especially to teachers. It's very forthright. So instead, you're supposed to say "对吗?" Which is like yes, right? Is that right? 明白不 is like, do you understand or not? 对不对? 对不对 is also yes, not yes, which is also very, you'd say that between friends, like usually maybe in a situation where you're talking, you're having a conversation wherein maybe someone's trying to make a point, right? You wouldn't say that to your teacher though. 对不对? 对吗? 明白不? Do you understand or not? If you don't understand, I can't help you. All right, so I'm going to leave it there, folks. I hope you found that at least a little bit helpful, a little bit interesting. And if you're wondering why there is these jump cuts in this episode, it's because the last episode I did, I realized that I shot it on my cell phone. I'm doing it again on my cell phone. That this phone just created one block of video file, which is fine. And I thought I wanted it that way until I went to go transfer it to my computer, at which point it said it didn't like it. And it says, nope, we won't take this. Actually, it didn't say anything. It just froze. Like the computer stopped transferring the file. It stopped at 4 gigs, which if you do some computer research, the issue with these computers today, most of them either NTFS or well, there's FAT32. What's the Apple one? Is that? I can't remember. Apple, you can also format it to exFAT. You can format these. If you do exFAT, then it takes any file size, basically. But NTFS and FAT32, FAT32, those only take up to 4 gigs, which is why if you have something like a GoPro or most modern cameras, most cell phones, they will typically cut up your videos into 2 gigabyte portions. That's why when you have like a 20-minute video, you have 10 files. You're going, why is there so many files? It's because the file system on your computers typically max out at 4 gigs. So, and that's what it is. So now I have this 10 gig file that I had to crunch down to 1080p and then also cut up into a few different portions. So that's why today I have this little Bluetooth thingamajig that I've been being able to wirelessly control my cell phone. So I stop it every couple of minutes just to reset the timer basically, and that's it. It's more for, I'm going to stitch these all together anyway and then make one video from it. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed that. Thanks for listening, and yeah, if you have a chance, you can head over to my website, stevensersky.com. That's where I keep a lot of the stuff about my travels and my other language exploits. I'm not sure if I'm going to start a separate website for this just yet. Something to think about, but not just yet. All right, going to leave it there. Thanks for listening. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Any questions, comments, get in touch, and we'll talk again. Bye-bye.